My name's Damien. My marriage to Cassandra ended when our twin daughters, Natalia and Lily, were still toddlers. They had just turned 2, and our marriage had lasted 4 years. Those 4 years felt much longer than they really were, stretched thin by constant fighting, deep incompatibilities, and a growing realization that we'd made a mistake neither of us wanted to admit. The divorce began on a tense note. We argued about the smallest details, but when it came time for the custody hearings, something unexpected happened. Cassandra stopped showing up altogether. She missed the first hearing. Her lawyer offered excuses. She missed the second, more excuses. By the third, her lawyer had withdrawn completely. Cassandra never fought for custody. She simply disappeared. I was granted full custody by default. No shared parenting, no alternating weekends. Just me and 2 little girls who kept asking when their mom would come home. I told them that mommy needed some time to figure things out and that she wouldn't be around for a while. They cried, and I held them close. The next 15 years were the toughest and most fulfilling of my life. I worked as an operations manager at a manufacturing firm in Durham, North Carolina. The pay was decent enough to keep us going, but the job demanded everything from me. Long hours, occasional weekends, constant problem solving. I'd leave the office around 5:30, pick the girls up from after-school care, drive home, cook dinner, help with homework, give baths, read bedtime stories, and collapse into bed around 11. Then I'd wake at 6 and start all over again. I skipped work events for school plays. I turned down promotions that required travel because I couldn't leave the girls with a sitter for days. I learned how to braid hair by watching YouTube tutorials at midnight after they'd gone to sleep. I also taught myself how to cook proper meals instead of relying on frozen dinners and takeout. We lived in a small 2-bedroom rental in a quiet suburb. The girls shared one room filled with posters, stuffed animals, and everything kids tend to collect, while I had the other. Money was tight, especially at first. I stretched every paycheck, used coupons, bought clothes secondhand, skipped expensive camps and trendy gadgets. But somehow we made it work. They always had what they needed: food, a roof over their heads, school supplies, birthday cakes, Christmas presents. Maybe not every luxury, but enough. And they thrived. They loved learning, always reading, always curious about how things worked. They did well in school, polite and balanced, even with only one parent. I felt a quiet pride in what I'd built for them: stability, love, consistency, all the things Cassandra couldn't give. I never spoke poorly of their mother, though sometimes I wanted to. When they asked about her, which happened less and less over the years, I told them that sometimes people just aren't ready to be parents, and that it wasn't their fault. I didn't want them to grow up carrying resentment or guilt. 15 years passed like that. When they turned 17, they were preparing for graduation, talking about universities. I was proud of how far we'd come. Then, one evening in early June, my phone rang from an unfamiliar number. I almost didn't answer. I'd gotten used to letting unknown calls go to voicemail. But something told me to pick up. The voice was faintly familiar. It was Cassandra. She said she wanted to reconnect with the girls, that they were still her daughters, and she was in a better place now. She said she'd remarried, had stability, and wanted to be part of their lives again. I sat on the couch, phone pressed to my ear, unsure what to say. My first instinct was to protect them, to tell her she'd forfeited that right when she walked away 15 years ago, that she couldn't just reappear now that the hard years were behind us. But I also knew it wasn't completely my decision. They were nearly adults. They had the right to choose if they wanted her in their lives. I told Cassandra I'd think about it. I didn't promise anything, just said I'd talk to the girls first. She agreed, gave me her number, and we ended the call. Afterward, I sat there for a long time, staring at nothing. That night, I told the girls about the call. They were sitting in the living room, busy on their devices, so before I began, I asked them to put everything away because I needed to talk about something important. They looked worried right away. I didn't usually sit them down for serious talks unless something truly important was going on. I told them their mother had called and wanted to see them. The room went completely silent. Their expressions mixed shock with confusion. Then the questions started coming all at once. Where had she been? Why now? What did she want? Was she all right? I answered honestly where I could. I didn't know where she'd been or what she'd been doing. I didn't know why she'd chosen this moment. She said she wanted to reconnect. And yes, she seemed okay. I told them the choice was entirely theirs. I wouldn't push them in either direction. but I needed to know how they truly felt about it. They exchanged glances, some silent understanding passing between them that only twins seemed to share. Natalia spoke first. She admitted she was curious, that she'd always wondered about Cassandra and wanted to meet her at least once. Lily nodded in agreement, saying she felt the same way. There was a quiet yearning in her voice, the sound of a little girl who still wanted to know her mother. It broke my heart to hear it, but I understood. You can't suppress the part of your children that still wants to love the person who left them. So I agreed to arrange a meeting. I called Cassandra the next day, and we set up something simple, a casual lunch at a neutral, public place with no pressure. The meeting was planned for the following Saturday. When the day arrived, I drove the girls to the restaurant, my stomach in knots the whole way. We got there a few minutes early. Cassandra was already waiting by the window. She looked different, older, of course, but more polished, more put together. She stood up when we approached and smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. She looked nervous. She hugged both girls. They stood stiffly, uncertain how to respond. Then we all sat down. At first, the conversation was awkward, basic questions about school, hobbies, college plans. Cassandra spoke like someone trying to catch up on a show she'd missed years of. The girls were polite but cautious. I mostly stayed quiet, just observing. By the end of lunch, things had relaxed a little. Cassandra asked if they'd like to meet again. They said yes. We left the restaurant with plans for another get-together the following week. Over the next few weeks, the meetings became more frequent. Soon, the girls were being invited to her house. They'd come home with stories about it. The pool, the home theater, the fancy kitchen. They'd mention Cassandra's husband, the trips he'd taken, the people he knew. Then they started returning with things. New clothes, designer labels I could never afford. New phones, tablets, pricey sneakers. At first, I stayed quiet. I told myself Cassandra was just trying to make up for lost time, showing her affection the way she knew how. But soon, I noticed other changes. They began comparing things, small comments that felt like little cuts, even if they didn't mean them that way. One evening, Lily said Cassandra's house felt freer. I asked what she meant. She shrugged and said there were just fewer rules there. Natalia mentioned how nice it was to have a pool to relax by. I reminded her we had a perfectly good public pool nearby. She rolled her eyes. One night, I overheard Natalia on the phone with a friend. Her door was partly open, and in our small house, voices carried. She was talking about college applications, saying her mother's husband had offered to help, that he had connections at several universities and could make things easier. I felt a tightness in my chest as I listened, but said nothing. The visits grew longer, first afternoons, then full days, then weekends. Eventually, they were spending several weekdays there too. I started eating dinner alone most nights. The house felt emptier each time. I tried talking to them about it. They said everything was fine, that they were just spending time with their mom. Exactly what I'd agreed to. I couldn't argue with that, so I didn't. But the emotional distance between us kept growing. Then, we ran into a boundary issue. Our house had simple, reasonable rules, nothing harsh. A curfew on school nights. A requirement to check in if plans changed. Our household had always been built on simple respect and open communication. Suddenly, even those basic rules were being challenged. One Friday night, Natalia came home 2 hours past curfew. No call, no text. I was still awake when she walked in, casual as ever. I asked where she'd been. She said she was at her mom's and lost track of time. I told her that wasn't acceptable, that she still needed to let me know when she'd be late. She sighed dramatically, like I was being unreasonable. Lily came downstairs after hearing our voices and immediately took her sister's side. She said I was being controlling and that Natalia was practically an adult now. I tried to stay calm, explaining that this wasn't about control, it was about respect and communication. We lived under the same roof, and courtesy mattered. That's when everything escalated. Natalia accused me of trying to assert control because I felt threatened by their mother's husband's influence. I told her that was nonsense, that it had nothing to do with him. Lily's tone sharpened. She said maybe if I weren't so strict all the time, they wouldn't prefer being at their mom's. I felt my patience slipping, but I kept my voice steady. I reminded them that I'd raised them alone for 15 years, that I'd sacrificed more than they could ever realize to make sure they were okay, and that I deserved at least basic respect in my own home. That's when Lily said it. The words that cut deeper than anything else. You're just jealous because Mom's husband is a better father than you ever were. Before I could even process it, Natalia added her own blow. We already told him yes to adopting us. He actually wants us. Silence filled the room. I just stood there, staring at them as something inside me went completely still. There's a kind of pain that doesn't bring tears, it just hollows you out. I didn't yell. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself or point out how absurd their words were. I simply turned and walked to my bedroom, closing the door quietly behind me. I sat on the edge of the bed in the dark. 15 years of sacrifice, 15 years of putting them before everything, reduced to nothing in a few careless sentences. I felt numb. Then something else came to mind, something they didn't know. Years earlier, when the girls were still little, I had set up a trust fund for their future. It wasn't lavish, I couldn't afford that. But every month, I contributed what I could. Sometimes $100, sometimes $50, sometimes $20, but never skipped a month. Over 15 years, the fund had grown into a solid amount, enough to pay for in-state tuition, housing, and living costs for both of them through 4 years of college. Not a fortune, but meaningful. I'd set up the trust carefully with my lawyer. The money was specifically for their education and only available while they remained under my guardianship. The clause was explicit. If guardianship ever transferred to someone else, if they were adopted, the trust would immediately dissolve and the funds would revert to me. I'd added that clause intentionally to protect the purpose of the money. I'd never told the girls about it. I wanted it to be a surprise, a way to show that I'd always been planning for their future. But now, sitting in the dark, I realized their talk of adoption had serious legal consequences. If Cassandra's husband actually adopted them, the guardianship would end, and the trust would automatically void. I didn't tell them. I didn't march back out there to throw it in their faces. I just sat with the realization. The next morning, I called my lawyer, the same one who'd handled my divorce and custody years earlier, and who'd helped me set up the trust. I explained everything. He confirmed what I already suspected. If the girls were adopted, the trust would be null, and the funds would legally revert to me. I asked him to update all related paperwork to make that clause even clearer, leaving no room for confusion. He said he'd handle it. The following days were unbearable. The tension in the house was thick. The girls clearly felt guilty but were too proud to apologize. They avoided me, staying in their rooms or spending most of their time at Cassandra's. I continued my daily routine, but emotionally, I'd already detached. Then one Sunday afternoon, Cassandra called. She said the girls had decided to move in with her and her husband permanently, that it would be better for everyone. I didn't argue. I didn't try to change their minds. I simply said, okay. She sounded surprised by how calmly I accepted it. She probably expected resistance, maybe even a fight. When none came, she ended the call quickly. That week, the girls packed up their things. I stood in the doorway, watching them box up clothes, books, devices, all the bits and pieces of their childhoods. They cleared closets, pulled down posters, packed away stuffed animals they'd kept long after outgrowing them. They barely made eye contact. When they did, I could see discomfort there, maybe even doubt, but they kept packing. When they were done, Cassandra arrived with her husband's SUV. They stood awkwardly in the entryway. Natalia opened her mouth as if to speak, then closed it again. Lily looked down at the floor. I was the one who spoke first, keeping my tone calm and steady. I told them I loved them, that I always would, no matter what. I hoped they'd be happy. Natalia mumbled something that might have been a thanks or goodbye. Lily just nodded, her eyes suddenly brimming with tears. Then they left. I stood in the doorway, watching Cassandra's car disappear around the corner. When it was gone, I closed the door, walked back into the now empty house, and sat on the couch in complete silence. The house felt enormous without them. Their absence was felt in every corner. The empty bedrooms, the quiet hallways, the kitchen no longer needing to accommodate multiple schedules. Over the next week, I made some decisions. There was no reason to keep a 3-bedroom house I didn't need. The rent was manageable, but unnecessary for one person. I gave notice to my landlord that I'd be moving out at the end of the lease, which conveniently was coming up in a few weeks. I began looking for a smaller apartment and found a modest 1-bedroom closer to work. It was less than half the size of the house, functional, affordable, and perfectly adequate for my needs. I spent weekends sorting through belongings, deciding what to keep and what to donate. Furniture I wouldn't need went to charity, along with the girls' bedroom sets, extra chairs, and kitchen items suited for a larger household. I kept only what was essential. Moving day required just one trip with a small rental truck. The new apartment was sparse: a bed, a couch, a small dining table with 2 chairs, basic kitchenware, my clothes, and a few books. That was it. No pictures on the walls, no decorative items. It wasn't meant to be cozy, just a place to sleep and eat. My routine simplified. I woke up, went to work, came home, cooked simple meals for one, read or watched TV, and went to bed. Weekends were quiet and uneventful. I didn't reach out to the girls. No calls, no texts. I didn't ask Cassandra about them. I simply existed in this smaller, solitary life. I never spoke badly about them to anyone. The few coworkers who knew I had daughters received short, neutral answers. They were living with their mother and doing fine. That was all. 3 months passed like this. My life reached a kind of equilibrium. Work was manageable. Expenses dropped without 2 extra mouths to feed. I was neither happy nor unhappy. Then, one Tuesday afternoon at work, my phone rang. Cassandra's name appeared on the screen. I hesitated, but curiosity won. I stepped outside into the parking lot and answered. There was no small talk. She demanded to know when I would pay the girls' college fees. She said Natalia and Lily had both been admitted weeks earlier and that payments were required immediately, or they'd lose their spots. I stood there, confused. No one had informed me about any college admissions. She insisted they'd been accepted over the summer. I asked why I hadn't been told. She snapped that I should have stayed informed about my daughter's lives. A flash of anger hit me, but I kept calm. I reminded her that the girls had moved out, chosen to live with her and her husband, and cut off communication with me. I had respected their decision by not inserting myself where I wasn't wanted. She ignored that entirely and continued talking about the payments. The amounts weren't huge. I interrupted her, stating simply that since the girls chose to live with her and her husband, and Natalia mentioned that her husband would handle their college applications and had connections, I assumed he would also cover the financial side. There was a pause. Then Cassandra's tone became more aggressive. She accused me of being petty and vindictive, punishing the girls for wanting a relationship with their mother, claiming I was a bad father if I abandoned them financially out of spite. I stayed calm. I told her I wasn't abandoning anyone. They had made their choice about where to live and who they wanted as a parental figure. Naturally, those choices had consequences. As she became increasingly hostile, I ended the call mid-sentence, stood for a moment, and returned inside to finish my work. That evening, I reflected on the conversation. Part of me felt vindicated. The girls had chosen their mother's husband because of his wealth and connections. They had dismissed me as inadequate, only to find out that money and promises were no substitute for genuine commitment. Yet another part of me just felt sorrow. They were losing opportunities. College acceptances don't wait for mistakes or misjudgments. Still, I didn't reach out. They had made their choice, and this was the natural consequence. After that call, there was total silence. No texts from the girls, no calls, nothing. 5 months passed in this quiet routine. I settled deeper into my solitary life. I devoted more time to reading, tackling books I'd always wanted to read but never had the time for. I found a strange peace in the simplicity, no constant feeling of failing someone's expectations. Some nights, I thought about Natalia and Lily, wondering how they were doing, whether they were happy with Cassandra, or if they even thought about me. But I didn't act. No calls, no visits, no attempts to reach out. I let the distance remain. Then, one evening, months after Cassandra's call, I was at home making dinner when my phone buzzed with a message from Lily. It was long, several paragraphs. I sat down on the couch to read it carefully. It began with apologies for being short-sighted, for the harsh words, for the way they had treated me. The message went on to explain what had happened after moving in with their mother and her husband. The first few weeks had been wonderful. They enjoyed the luxury, the pool, the beautiful rooms, the expensive meals, and the freedom from rules. But everything changed once the college acceptance letters arrived. Their mother's husband had promised to handle all the arrangements and support their future. Yet when it came time to pay, his attitude shifted completely. He began complaining about the cost of college, about already supporting Cassandra and her lifestyle, about not signing up to pay for someone else's children. His remarks grew frequent and pointed: freeloaders, handouts, knowing their place. He never addressed Natalia and Lily directly, but they clearly understood who he meant. The college deadlines passed. He never paid. Their spots were lost, taken by others on the wait list. The message continued. The girls had tried discussing the situation with Cassandra privately, but her defenses were weak. She claimed her husband was stressed, meant well, or was simply overwhelmed. Over time, they realized Cassandra had no real influence in the household. She was financially dependent, living under his rules, his house, his cars, his lifestyle. She could not, or would not, stand up for them. They began feeling increasingly unwelcome. The atmosphere grew hostile. They felt like intruders rather than family members. The message concluded with a direct request. Could they come back home? They understood I was angry and knew they had made terrible choices. But they wanted to return, promising they had learned their lesson, that they now understood what they had and taken for granted, and that they would do better. I read the message twice and set the phone down, feeling a tangled mix of emotions. Part vindication, I had been right about the hollowness behind their mother's glamorous life. Part sadness, they had lost real opportunities. Part uncertainty, should I let them return after everything they'd said? Could I trust that they had changed, or would they leave again when something better came along? I didn't respond that night, nor the next day, nor the day after. For days later, I finally called Lily. She answered on the first ring, her voice both breathless and hopeful. I kept my tone calm but distant, telling her I had received the message and had been thinking about it. Then I said, I don't have space for you girls anymore. Things have changed here. There was silence, then soft crying. I continued, explaining that I'd downsized after they left. I now lived in a one-bedroom apartment, set up for one, not three. The crying grew louder. I could hear Natalia in the background. Both of them were clearly upset. They asked if they could at least visit, pleading to see me in person and talk. I hesitated. Part of me wanted to say no, to maintain the distance. But another part, the part that had raised them, loved them through everything, couldn't entirely refuse. I told them they could come by that weekend, Saturday afternoon. They thanked me through tears, and then we ended the call. Saturday arrived. At 2 o'clock, there was a knock at the door. I opened it to find Natalia and Lily standing there, looking humbled. I stepped aside and let them in. They walked into the small apartment, and I observed their expressions as they took it all in. They sat together on the couch, and I took a chair at the dining table, facing them. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Natalia began to talk. She apologized again, this time more genuinely than in her message. I could see true remorse and shame on their faces. They explained that they had realized, far too late, what they had given up, that they'd been tempted by luxury and the idea of an easier life, without valuing the sacrifices I had made. When they finished, I remained silent for a moment before responding. I acknowledged their apology and said I appreciated their honesty about what had happened. But I also told them that trust, once broken the way theirs had been, doesn't automatically return just because someone apologizes. Their words had hurt me deeply, reducing 15 years of sacrifice to jealousy, claiming that someone who'd only known them for months was a better father than the person who had raised them alone since they were toddlers. Those words cut deeper than they likely realized, and healing from that takes time. They both nodded, accepting this. Natalia said they understood how much they had damaged our relationship and that they didn't expect instant forgiveness. Lily promised they would earn back my trust, however long it took. They would accept any rules or expectations I set and work to support themselves rather than relying entirely on me. They meant it. I could see that. But I had also changed. I wasn't the same person who had accommodated every need and allowed myself to be taken for granted. I told them I would need time to think, that this wasn't a decision I could make in one afternoon. They asked if we could at least stay in contact while I considered everything. Phone calls, occasional conversations. I agreed. About an hour later, they left. Each hugged me before going, and I hugged them back, careful not to linger too long. I spent the rest of the day reflecting. Over the following week, we spoke several times on the phone. They called every other day or so, not pushy, just wanting to talk. They told me about their current situation. Their mother's husband barely spoke to them, and Cassandra was caught in the middle, unable to intervene effectively. Since the adoption had never legally occurred, they were still my dependents, and the trust fund remained valid. 2 weeks after their visit, I called Natalia to inform her of my decision. I told them they could come back, but things would be different this time. I would start looking for a 2-bedroom apartment suitable for the 3 of us. They would need to contribute financially through part-time jobs, not large sums, but enough to teach them about shared responsibility. College plans would need to be completely reconsidered, and household rules would be stricter than before, non-negotiable.